So thank you very much for joining us. We're extremely fortunate today to have with us Professor Elizabeth Ingleson from the London School of Economics, where she is Assistant Professor of International History. Before starting at the LSE, Professor Ingleson completed her PhD at the University of Sydney and then held various fellowships at a number of places in the United States, including Yale, Southern Methodist University, and the University of Virginia. And she's here to talk to us today about her book, a very interesting book that I've just had the pleasure to read recently, called Made in China, When U.S.-China Interests Converged to Transform Global Trade. And so with that, I'll turn things over to her to speak for as long as she likes on this topic. And then afterwards, we'll have some time for discussion and then questions from the audience. So thank you very much, and please go ahead.
Great, thank you so much, William. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank you for the invitation, and Shamsher and others at the Centre for Geopolitics for making this such a effortless and enjoyable process. It's a real pleasure and honour to be able to share my work with you all. So thank you also for joining online. It's always, a bit of a sort of semi-threat to the audience, I think, when an academic gets told you can speak for as long as you like. But I promise that I will keep my remarks to around the 30-minute space. I want to introduce the book and introduce the key ideas and really try and, as much as possible, open up the space for conversation and questions. And I'd really like to hear from you all as well. So I'm going to give an overview of the ideas, some of the key arguments, and then we can converse. Okay, let me see if I am going to be able to successfully share my PowerPoint slides. All right. So in Made in China, the book that I want to talk about today, that's just come out really only the last couple of weeks here in the UK, but about a month in the United States and elsewhere in the world. In this book, I explore the labour and the diplomacy of US-China trade as a shared history. And I do so by drawing together two historical processes of the 1970s that are usually understood separately: deindustrialization in the United States and diplomatic rapprochement between the United States and China. So in turning to these two contexts, deindustrialization and rapprochement, I join a vibrant conversation of scholars who ask, scholars of China, who ask how and why did China converge with global capitalism, and when did this convergence begin? So Deng Xiaoping's reforms, announced in December 1978, loom large in these accounts, but scholars disagree on the extent to which these reforms marked a new beginning in China's engagement with global capitalism. One group of scholars do see 1978 as a starting point, tracing the origins of China's extraordinary growth to Deng's reforms. It was in the 1980s that China escaped the debt trap that ensnared other developing nations and that ultimately led to the Soviet Union's collapse. In these scholars' telling, it was the reform era of the 1980s and 1990s that enabled China to develop its own unique form of political economy that converged with global capitalism and enabled China to lift so many of its people out of poverty. A second group of scholars emphasise continuity between the Mao and Deng eras. Experiments with marketisation and trade, they argue, occurred from the very founding of the People's Republic. One scholar goes so far as to suggest an, I quote, unending capitalism in China, even at the height of communist rule. In his telling, consumerism, which persisted in small pockets of the country, was a sign that Mao's economy was, in fact, a variety of capitalism. The PRC was therefore never the socialist economy Mao strove so hard to achieve. So my book similarly seeks to blur the 1978 divide, but But unlike scholars who emphasize continuity throughout the Maoist era, I see the major turning point in China's convergence with capitalism to lie in the late 1960s and early 1970s. I join a third group of scholars who locate the sources of China's 20th century convergence with capitalism in the latter years of the Cultural Revolution. Exploring Maoism at the grassroots as well as from above, these scholars situate the Cultural Revolution as a key moment in China's political economy. The paradox of the Cultural Revolution, this body of literature shows, is that it wrought such extreme social and political upheaval that it unintentionally opened the way for new institutions and reform policies to emerge. It was amidst the social and political chaos of the 1970s that Chinese leaders within and beyond elite levels of politics experimented with economic reorganization that sowed the seeds of the reforms that came afterwards. So my book adds two crucial components to our understanding of this convergence, this sort of third group of scholars that I see myself to be in conversation with. And first, it adds and explores the growth of trade, international trade, in the late Mao era of the late 1960s and 1970s, of which there has been remarkably little attention until recently. Throughout the 1970s, China rapidly expanded its foreign trade, especially with advanced capitalist nations. At first, these changes were only slowly perceptible. In 1969, China's total trade stood at 3.8 billion, about the same figure that China's foreign trade had been in the 1950s and 1960s. In 1971, this had risen to an all-time high of 4.8 billion. By 1974, the value of trade had skyrocketed to a further 14 billion. China's total trade remained around this level until 1978, when it jumped to 21 billion. The second core component of this convergence that I focus on and bring to this conversation is changes within US capitalism itself. Because to speak of China's convergence with capitalism is to, without including the conversation about changes within US capitalism, is to assume a static form of capitalism. And so just as there were changes happening within China, the increase in international trade, so too was the capitalism with which China was converging, so too was it changing. So by the early 1970s, manufacturing processes were becoming increasingly international, with non-communist East Asia emerging as a central hub. Corporations had long been multinational in scope, but for centuries they focused on resource extraction, such as bananas, cotton, or oil, dependent on the forced labor of enslaved peoples. In the decades after the Second World War, a new kind of manufacturing multinational began to emerge, one that outsourced production to low-wage economies to sell to customers around the globe, including back home. They were aided by developments in technology such as containerized shipping and aircraft that allowed goods to travel further and faster. But they were reliant most of all upon political choices that supported their emergence. For 20 years, these emerging changes in the US economy had been underpinned by Cold War divisions between capitalism and communism. And the small amount of trade that flowed between the two systems was understood in binary terms, East-West trade, not integrated ones. In the 1970s, this binary remained in place, but elements of it began to soften when it came to trade with China. So in addition to asking why China converged with capitalism then, I'm interested in the reverse as well. I'm interested in asking why did US capitalists start to incorporate China into their visions of the future? And what did these visions look like? So the answers to these questions require us to look more closely at the 1970s and integrate perspectives from business history, cultural history, and the history of capitalism into the histories of modern China and the US in the world. For the first time since the Korean War, business people from across the United States began to jockey for visas and insights into a trade market that their European and Japanese rivals had had access to for years. Some were Chinese American, children of missionaries, or long-time students of Chinese language and history, but others were executives from large corporations with little familiarity with China at all. Large multinational corporations like Walmart and Apple would, by the end of the 20th century, come to be most associated with US-China trade. Yet it was the new generation of US business people in the 1970s, including Veronica Yap, Charles Abrams, and David Rockefeller, who paved their way. Now, maverick entrepreneurs and suited executives from US corporations are not the usual protagonists in the histories of 1970s US-China relations. Instead, President Nixon and Chairman Mao and the elite policymaking that they represent have dominated the narratives of bilateral relations in this era. Just as Nixon and Kissinger quickly turned their gaze back to geopolitics after adjusting trade rules, so too have historians devoted only passing interest to the trade relationship that unfolded. This limited attention towards US business people who traded with China in the 1970s is partly because the value of trade was tiny. By the end of the decade, total trade reached only around $2 billion. But when we look at trade in qualitative terms rather than quantitative ones, and when we focus on business people and corporations, we see a fundamental transformation in the bilateral relationship that ultimately had long-term repercussions for global capitalism and labor. We see, in fact, that over the course of the decade, the interests of US capitalists and the Chinese state gradually converged at the expense of US labor and aided by US diplomats. Ultimately, US and Chinese business people reconfigured what it meant to even speak of US-China trade. So at the heart of my book, I argue that business people from the United States and pragmatists within China worked together to transform the very meaning of the China market from a place to sell US goods to a site instead of cheap labor. Now, for hundreds of years, US-China trade looked very different. Since first contacts in the 18th century, US merchants had understood trade with China to mean expanding their exports. Throughout the United States and Europe, the imagined possibilities of a vast landmass teeming with potential customers compelled business people to trade with China. In the early 20th century, Missouri adman Carl Crow encapsulated this idea with his 1937 best-selling book, based upon his 25 years living and working in China. Its evocative title quickly saw 400 million customers become a metonym for the potential profits to be made from trade with China. In the 1970s, the Crow conception of trade remained a prominent part of the trading culture. But some US business people and their Chinese counterparts began to see also a new promise, 800 million workers as well. They not only imported items such as porcelain, robes, and tapestries, which had overt links to China, but they also began to purchase shirts, shoes, and gloves that did not have obvious connections to China itself. Encouraged by Chinese traders and pragmatists who were keen on increasing their exports, these business people and Chinese leaders together reconfigured the very meaning of trade and the China market. Just 30-odd years after Crow published his best-selling book, US business people began to transform the centuries-long vision of a China market filled with 400 million proverbial customers into one of 800 million workers in the stead. Now, the transformation of the China market from 400 million customers to 800 million workers was enabled, I show, by three interconnected factors: cultural, diplomatic, and economic. It relied upon a cultural change that saw the two nations move from Cold War foes to amicable trade partners, from Red China to Made in China. It was propelled by different diplomatic approaches as to how trade could be used to assist geopolitical negotiations in this unusual limbo period of diplomatic rapprochement. And it was underpinned by economic transformations in both nations. All three of these factors intersected in ways that ultimately reconfigured the very meaning and practice of US-China trade. Now, I want to focus on ways that we can see these three dynamics, cultural, diplomatic, and economic, intersect. And I want to give you two examples of this. The first was a social and political recasting of the two nations from Cold War foes to amicable trade partners, from Red China to Made in China. And US business people were crucial to this transition. Through a process that I label fashion diplomacy, they marketed and profited off China's ancient past or transformed its communist present into a purchasable revolutionary fashion statement. A selling point of these Mao coats, in the image you can see here on the right, this is an ad selling coats, workers' jackets, as you can see here, from the People's Republic of China. So it says worn by Chinese workers and peasants. The sort of selling point was the fact that it had been worn by workers and was advertised to US consumers as these kinds of Maoist kitsch, Maoist commodities. Importers and the retailers and marketers that they worked with rendered invisible the brutal reality of forced labour and divided families that lay behind those who would have worn these items. So from Fifth Avenue runways to at-home dressmakers using Chinese silk to Mao coat wearing university students, fashion diplomacy relied upon a celebratory commodification of China, in which the Chinese origins of the imported goods were a central component of their desirability, and Chinese communism was rendered apolitical and unthreatening. The second key shift that I want to look at that sort of illustrates this idea of the movement from 400 million customers to 800 million workers is seen when we look at textiles, which is just one of the commodities that I explore in the book. And the transformation from customers to workers was enabled by changes within US capitalism and manufacturing on the one hand, and the economic experiments happening within China on the other hand, which throughout the 1970s both became mutually constitutive. So this was a time when China's economy was still reeling from the upheaval of the Cultural Revolution. Amidst the chaos and destruction, pragmatists within the Chinese Politburo sought to increase foreign exports in order to obtain credit that they could then use to buy turnkey factories and other industrial goods. As a consequence, China's foreign trade really began to accelerate beginning in the 1970s. Li Xianyan, Chen Yun, Deng Xiaoping, and other Chinese pragmatists, all of whom would go on to play important roles in China's reforms of the 1980s, slowly experimented in the 1970s with ways of using exports to fund industrialization, selling cotton goods, for example, to pay for fertilizer factories. So these were ideas that they were formulating and putting into practice, such as at the Canton Trade Fair, which I look at in a chapter, and I'm happy to talk about more in Q&A. But these experiments were also met with considerable setback. China did not produce manufactured goods on a large scale. and its leaders did not permit multinational corporations to make capital investments. So Walmart, for example, couldn't set up shop. Or JCPenney, which worked much closely with China in the 1970s, again, couldn't set up shop there. It could import it imported what it could back home. So for most of this period, then the efforts of these pragmatists experimenting within the Politburo were met, moreover, with considerable opposition from the radical wing of the Politburo, whom Mao would label the Gang of Four. So too in this era were US corporations experimenting with their own manufacturing processes. They were increasingly turning to overseas sources of production and increasing their imports. This was aided in part by containerization, which made shipping faster and cheaper, but it was additionally enabled by legislative changes, including the end of the Bretton Woods system and the 1974 Trade Act. In 1973, for example, JCPenney's, one of the major retailing corporations in the United States, its imports in 1973 comprised a very small proportion of its total merchandise. Across its 1,700 stores, only around 10% of Penny's goods were imported. So most of the items manufactured, most of the items sold within JCPenney were manufactured within the United States. So again, just to underscore, JCPenney 1973, most of what it was selling was made in the United States. Only 10% or so was imported. But its confidential 5-year plan that I found in the archives and is very aptly named the company plan, right? This sort of very creative title for the 5-year plan. The company plan, right? It aimed to have JCPenney and its imports increase over time, to have by 1978 imports make up 14% of the total merchandise sold in its stores. And if I quote for a moment an internal memo, JCPenney executives wrote, "We believe that several of our competitors are considerably more active in this area than we have been," the plan nervously articulated. "Both Sears and Ward's have more extensive networks of overseas offices and are better established in several markets." So there was a real sense that Penny's retailing competitors were getting ahead of them in terms of sort of turning towards imports as measures of stocking merchandise. And so as JCPenney adapts itself to the new capacity to import and new capacity to do so cheaply, JCPenney lists China as a key source for increasing its imports in its 5-year outlook. So as you can see here on page 34 of the company plan, it lists a whole range of nations, including South America, Eastern Europe, China, Russia, and India. So JCPenney then was implementing its changes in retailing and incorporated China's own experiments with trade into its vision. These visions worked together to create a new idea of what the China market represents, one not just where the United States would export its goods there, but instead import manufactured items from China. As JCPenney's company magazine publicly put it when it sort of spoke of the appeal of China to its wider readership, particularly members within the company itself, as they argued, the average wage in the China factory is about $25 a month, but Penny representatives seem convinced that Chinese export prices have little relation to production cost. So in other words, Chinese goods were as cheap as they came because price did not reflect workers' wages. So this shifting landscape of US-China trade, from Red China to Made in China, and from 400 million customers to 800 million workers, was highly contingent and uncertain, and very few predicted that the relationship would boom anytime soon. Throughout the decade, most Americans interested in trade focused their attention not on China, but on Japan and on its impact on the United States. One economist, Branko Milanovic, reflected recently on the projections of his peers, projections of economists in the 1970s, and noted that China is remarkable by its absence in these books. No one, Milanovic concludes, took notice of China yet. But there was, in fact, one group of Americans who loudly and consistently paid attention to China's economic potential well before economists and policymakers of the 21st century. From the very reopening of trade ties in the early 1970s, organized US labor representatives and workers, especially those in the textile industry, warned of the impact that trade with China would have if greater industry safeguards were not implemented. Their concerns came in a volatile context when US imports of manufactured goods were rising, as we've seen with JCPenney, when manufacturing employment was decreasing, and the combined effects of skyrocketing inflation and unemployment spurred a new concept of stagflation. As workers and organized labor in the United States protested the ways the increasingly globalized world was emerging, they saw China as holding the potential to exacerbate these dynamics. Now, their efforts culminated in a landmark petition launched in late 1977 for quotas on imported Chinese cotton work gloves. Now, this was the first time US manufacturers had attempted to limit Chinese goods since the Communist Party came to power in 1949. As US workers began to mobilize against Chinese imports, their efforts very quickly became a diplomatic problem. And the 1977 petition for quotas on Chinese exports failed largely due to US and Chinese political interference. But it not only revealed a political prioritization of geopolitics over domestic US workers. Rather, the case also revealed a new dynamic emerging in the global economy that had profoundly important repercussions for China's reforms, US workers, and US-China trade more broadly. Because around 60% of all cotton work gloves that were being imported from China at the time were purchased by companies that also manufactured them. So in other words, the majority of the US corporations calling for restrictions on Chinese gloves were the very same groups purchasing the imports from China. As they struggled to keep their factories open during a period of widespread deindustrialization, especially in the textile industry, managers began to decrease their production of this kind of glove and replace these lines with imports, particularly from China. So in so doing, they hope to save on costs and continue making other more complex types of gloves, at least temporarily. So as they altered their own production processes, US manufacturers themselves began to see China and the China market as a source of inexpensive labor. But what they wanted most of all from the quotas and from pursuing these quotas was market order. They needed time to make the adjustments to using Chinese labor. They needed time to shift their lines of production so that at least cotton work gloves would be coming from imports. So the decisions of US manufacturers reveal a very crucial component of China's convergence with the capitalist trading system, was the change that was occurring in US corporations and the global division of labor that came with it. As Chinese leaders experimented with ways to lift their population out of poverty, this came at the expense of minimum wage textile workers in the United States and later other industries as well. But that impact on US workers was fundamentally enabled by decisions of executives at US corporations and enabled by US legislation in Washington. Because American business people had already slowly begun internationalizing their manufacturing trade before trade with China reopened. In the 1970s, Chinese leaders began to adapt experimentally and haltingly to these changing dynamics. So ultimately, mine is a book about change, from a China market of 400 million customers to 800 million workers. But underlying this story of change, however, is a deeply held continuity, and it's a political continuity, one that persistently frames trade and manufacturing in terms of the nation state, China's goods, and the United States' need to make more of its own. Despite the transformation in how US-China trade has operated in practice, for the rest of the 20th century, American political rhetoric remained bound up with the nation state and Karl Kroe's conception of 400 million customers. In 1983, for example, President Reagan spoke of restoring America's reputation as a reliable supplier of goods to China, even as he discussed the moderate growth of Chinese imports that he had signed into law via a 5-year textile agreement. Nearly 2 decades later, well after China had opened its markets to foreign direct investment, and well after companies like Apple and Walmart had established manufacturing facilities there, President Clinton framed the benefits of China's joining the World Trade Organization in terms of US sales. Speaking at the White House Rose Garden in 2000, he promised that World Trade Organization membership would open China's markets to American products made on American soil. So it was politically expedient for trade to remain in Clinton's depiction about US sales. Now, by this stage, the number of corporations that manufactured abroad had grown exponentially. The vision, the 5-year plan of JCPenney had accelerated to such an extent that American corporate structures had changed so profoundly. And yet the political rhetoric remained bound by these very early 20th century notions of trade. So at the heart of Made in China's symbolic power today lies a paradox. Because on the one hand, Made in China represents the epitome of globalized manufacturing. Behind these words lie cheap labor, cheap goods, and increasingly a Chinese threat. Goods marked with Made in China travel the globe, connecting people through a shared consumerism. But on the other hand, it has come to represent the nation state. Marketing scholars describe this connection between country of origin labels and the nation state as nation branding. So if Made in China represents a threat to American manufacturing, then its antithesis, Made in the USA, suggests that its effects could be countered too by the nation state. But as we know in 2024, especially in the era of COVID and evergreen, the goods labelled Made in China or Made in the US are often only partially made in those countries. Instead, they are produced along chains of supply that usually include multiple countries along the way. Global value chains are a familiar part of the globalized landscape by the early 21st century. And yet, the political power of thinking of manufacturing within the confines of the nation state retains its strength. So this is the 21st century paradox of Made in China. It simultaneously represents the nation state and globalization. And one of the major consequences of this rhetorical stasis is a deflection away from the corporations that pursue cheap labor at any cost and a singular focus on demonizing China for systemic economic problems within the United States and the capitalist system. Throughout the 1970s, it was the interests of US capitalists and the Chinese state that slowly began to align. 50 years later, their interests are nearly indistinguishable. As they reworked the meaning of the China market from a site of customers to one of workers in the 1970s, they were enabled by US diplomatic assumptions that trade was another form of people-to-people ties, that American business people building trade were informal diplomats, and that labor concerns were an impediment and an irritant to both trade and diplomacy. So if there's a lesson then to this history of the making of Made in China, it is not one that calls for a return to an imagined ideal of manufacturing employment. Rather, it is for a political vision that centres and listens to the concerns of working people in the contexts in which we operate, both domestically and internationally, and in the process frees itself from the idea that business people are informal diplomats working on behalf of the state. Geopolitics and globalization collided in the 1970s in ways that transformed and ultimately expanded US power. But a slower, quieter change was also beginning to take shape, in which the United States and China together constructed an interdependent trade relationship in the very moment that interdependence shaped US foreign policy. By making Made in China, US diplomats and business people used trade to lay the groundwork of a process that might one day mark the end of their empire and the re-emergence of China's. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Really wonderful talk about a fantastic book, which I really can't recommend highly enough to the audience members if they haven't yet had a chance to read it. For the audience, I should also remind everyone that if you'd like to ask a question, please do click on the Q&A tab, which in most configurations of Teams is at the top of your screen, and you can write your question there, and then I will pose that question for you. So before we get audience questions coming in, I would actually have more of an invitation to you than a question, which is one of the things I really enjoyed in the book when I read it are these kind of, they're not exactly side stories or anecdotes, but there's a sort of personal story of different individuals that you've alluded to in the talk, but that really are used to kind of animate the narrative in the book, I think, very, very nicely. And people like Veronica Yap and others who you mentioned, David Rockefeller and so on. But some of them that really stood out were the sort of more quirky or less intuitive ones. I mean, Don King selling basketballs, and Charles Abrams with the vodka. And the one that really I thought was very interesting was the Kellogg engineers spread out across various parts of China with their correspondence curriculum provided by Northwestern University for their kids out in the middle of nowhere, and hearing about Mao's death and all these things. So I wonder, would you like to share some of these sort of personal stories or individual narratives that you use so nicely in the book to sort of animate the broader story that you presented now in the talk?
William, thank you so much. That's a really generous question because, of course, with a sort of talk like this, the nature of at least what I wanted to do was outline the ideas, but I really appreciate, firstly, how closely you've read the book, and I appreciate the chance because what I really wanted to do with the book was trace these big, systemic questions about global systems and all the rest of it, trade, these big questions. But I also wanted to think about the ways that individuals operated within big global change. And I do very deliberately use anecdotes and narratives in order to illustrate some of the larger sort of ideas that I want to that I found their own actions were conveying, in fact. One person in particular you've mentioned is Veronica Yap, and I might start there because Veronica Yap really struck me as such an interesting individual right from the start of sort of my research into this. And she was one of the first business people to ever go, US business people to ever go to China. She went in 1971 before Nixon did. In fact, she was one of 3 Americans who went on US visas in 71. US business people who went, and what she did was she saw a capacity or a niche in the market to import Mao coats and import sort of Maoist commodities to sell to highbrow Americans in New York City at very, very inflated prices. And she found that in doing so, she was able to quit her job. She was trained as an architect, but she quit her job. She started up her own company. She called it Dragon Lady Traders. And really did it, made a killing, right? Selling Maoist goods to, as I say, university students for exorbitant prices, and really selling the revolution via consumption, right? But what was even more important to me was understanding the changes in Yap's decisions over time. So I trace Yap. She's one of the people who sort of appears in many of the chapters, and because her own business practices changed over time, so that by mid-decade she was beginning to import from China not just robes or Mao coats, but also T-shirts and things that did not have an overt relationship to China itself. And that is, I think, a really important analytical space with which to understand the ways that the cultural change that Yap was a part of in the early 70s in sort of making consumption of Chinese goods palatable and fashionable and appealing, and in the process rendering China apolitical, or its communism apolitical and not threatening. So that cultural change is very important to enabling the material change that she begins and others to implement by the mid-1970s, and that is to have non-overt Chinese goods, so just T-shirts, gloves, etc., coming in to the United States with a little label saying "Made in China." So making the process for consumers and the American public of seeing the word China on a produced object as not being associated with Red China or the Cold War threat. So that real cultural transformation was important to the material one. And that, of course, is something that gets taken up in a whole range of different sort of formats. So Don King, for example, this incredible gregarious promoter, well known for being the promoter of the sort of Rumble in the Jungle with Muhammad Ali. Don King sets up his own company where he imports Chinese basketballs and has this huge big elaborate party sort of showcasing the new Chinese basketballs and describes them as having mystic powers and all the rest of it, but really at the end of the day, as much as the marketing ploy was using China as an exotic site, the reality was that these Chinese basketballs were just cheaper, and that again is a sort of a way in which the economics and the culture really intersected to enable this larger change to occur.
Yeah, I mean, that really nice retelling of those stories as well. But one thing that strikes me particularly about Veronica Yap is that, I mean, I hadn't heard about her before I read your book, and if I recall correctly from your description in the book, I think she only advertised sort of exclusively in the New Yorker, maybe the Atlantic as well, right?
That's Charles Abrams, actually.
Oh, Charles Abrams with the vodka. That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
But
very close reading. Yeah.
But Veronica Yap, I mean, how did you come upon her or these other cases? I mean, Don King, I imagine, was flamboyant enough in this advertising campaign that there'd be lots of records of that in different sources if you just sort of scan across things. But how did you discover these sources or these people and their stories?
Yeah, I mean, you'd be surprised. Don King was not an easy or obvious find, actually. He was one of the later finds. I got extremely lucky with my process of research because I was able to I was able to at first use the published magazine records of the US-China Business Council, the US-China Review, which had a lot of details about people involved in the National Council for US-China Trade. So that gave me an indication of who are the key players involved in that. That's where I found out about Veronica Yap. But Veronica Yap in particular, if I could continue for her for a moment, because I think her story is really indicative of a lot of different dynamics.
But she's also one of the first people to go to the Canton Trade Fair, I think, right, as an American delegate. So she's sort of, she goes through all of the different stages in the book, which is, I think, a good reason to focus on her as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, and as I say, the reason I focused on her is because of her actions.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually found her in the sense of she was there in the documents, and so I really allowed for the actual archival research. So I began with the magazines, but then spent months and months and months in archives in Ann Arbor, in particular, where including a very when I was a grad student on a very shoestring budget, a tight moment when I needed a whole bunch of boxes to be declassified. So I was very, very lucky that I came across these boxes that hadn't been opened, and it's, sort of the scholars' excitement, especially a grad student's excitement, right? These never before used documents. But, the labor of the archivists was such that they had to go through every document to declassify them because they were held in the Ford Library, even though they weren't Ford administration papers. So I, through the archival records as well, really let them determine who were the people that mattered to this story. But Veronica Yap's story, I think, it struck me because she was one of the first in so many iterations of this history. But she was also, she faced considerable, obstacles. So one of the things I trace in the book is this genre of advice. I call it the advice literature that business people were writing to one another. And it makes sense, right? You need to sort of, if you are learning how to trade with a country after 20 years of isolation, you're the others wanting to get involved need some advice. And so this advice literature was very strikingly, maybe it's not a surprise, right? All male, very, very strikingly male, very strikingly white, in a group of business people who were actually relatively diverse. There was a relatively large number of women business people, for example. And I was particularly struck by the fact that Veronica Yap was very rarely consulted as a expert. When she was, I had this sort of moment in the book where I talk about an interview that she was part of, where other businessmen were sort of asked. She was the only woman and the only person of color, right? She was born in Shanghai, so she's the only person who wasn't white and male, and for half the interview, she was asked about her marital status. She was asked about, how do you feel being a woman in China? Things that had nothing to do with her business acumen, even though she was a pioneer in the business world. And she was the one pioneering having goods made and manufactured to size, for example. So having the Chinese factories make T-shirts that fit American sizings. Veronica Yap was at the forefront of that. If I'll just finish this story, if I can, for a moment, I actually gave a talk about specifically Veronica Yap and her as a sort of illustration of this larger history. I gave a talk in Hong Kong about a year ago, and through that talk actually met the niece of Veronica Yap herself, and really was able to connect with the family of Veronica, because what I had myself discovered in the archival work was that Veronica died soon after in the early 1980s, and didn't live to see the real fruits of the work that she so clearly pioneered. So it was a very incredibly honoring moment and meaningful moment to be able to sort of speak with her family members who didn't know this story, and didn't know.
Oh wow, they didn't know. That's
no,
really...
not the extent to which she really was central to this story. They knew she traded with China, but the extent to which the implications of these business people, not just Yap, but particularly Veronica Yap, was important.
There was another business person in textiles, Neumann, I think, Susan Neumann, is that right? Who was also very important, particularly in that transition from identifiably Chinese textiles to kind of more generic textiles for an American market. And didn't they interact as well at some point?
They were both members. I think you mean Susan Reynolds.
Reynolds.
Yeah.
How did I get that wrong?
There is a Neumann as well, but Neumann was a
somebody
man.
else.
I'm forgetting his first name. There are characters involved. No, William, you've read it so closely. I appreciate it. But yeah, so Veronica Yap and Susan Reynolds and many other business people, Francine Farkas, another woman involved in the China trade, to bigger and greater and lesser extents were involved with the US-China, the National Council for US-China Trade, which continues to exist today, and they were involved. Veronica Yap was on the committees and sort of really spearheading assistance for importers, and so there was the China trade world was quite small in this period. So people were very much interacting with one another. As I say, they were advising one another, creating these books and this literature about how to trade with China. So it was very much a tight-knit world. They would go to the Canton trade fairs and drink into the early hours of the morning and scheme about the various ways in which they were losing money but were going to trade anyway. So it was that element of adventure, I think, was very important to the trading culture as well. China was exciting and it was an exotic new frontier, and I think that very fact of the excitement made the loss of profit, which often occurred, like the lack of profit, it made that something more able to be tolerated.
Yeah, let me just remind the audience again, please do type any questions that you have into the Q&A tab, and we can certainly address those as well. So far, we haven't gotten any audience questions, although our audience is staying with us, which is very good. They're just not asking questions. So let me encourage them, please ask some questions. Let me then ask about the Canton Trade Fair, because this is something that also had long escaped my notice until I guess about 15 years ago, sort of the late 2000s, mid to late 2000s, I was going frequently to different places in China to research something completely different about sort of law and legal structures and institutions and so on. And it turns out I was in Guangzhou for that research, looking at sort of courts and policing mainly there. And I happened to be there at the time of one of the trade fairs. Right? They happen twice a year. At least now they do that. I think in the 70s, maybe only once a year. And then it was an absolute chaotic and frenetic hub of activity. Tons and tons of people. It was very difficult to get any place to stay in the city or to move around the city. And what it looked like then is that this was mostly business people coming from developing countries, or what we might call middle to lower income countries, who were there essentially to look for manufacturing partners, right? Who for whatever reason couldn't use what then was the popular platform to do this, which was Alibaba, right? To form these sort of transnational networks on an ad hoc basis for smaller firms. And so do you have a sense of sort of the evolutionary trajectory of the Canton Trade Fair? Right? Where does it start? What was the specific role in the 70s, and where does it evolve to after that? In maybe more interesting or subtle ways than the little bit that I saw on those couple of superficial observations.
Yeah, no, I'm so, of all the times I've been to Guangzhou, I used to live in Guilin, very close, but I never made it for various reasons during the time of the actual fair itself. So I've never actually seen it live, but it continues through to this day. Now, the history of the Canton Trade Fair in Guangzhou really was something that struck me as such a fascinating thread to follow myself. And it was established in the late 1950s. The first fair was held in 1957, and it was held very deliberately in Guangzhou to sort of and held in sort of just a few years right after Mao had established the People's Republic, and was very deliberately designed to be a space where China could control its foreign trade. Right, it could put limits on it. It could say that this is where you operate. These are the boundaries. You can't leave. Very much, therefore, sort of in keeping with the sort of Maoist rhetoric of the time of fighting against imperialism and the larger legacy of what Canton had become after the Opium Wars and the so-called sort of century of humiliation. So a very deliberate strategy in 1957 for Mao to set up a space for trade to occur, and it was at a time when Mao was perhaps more open to trading with foreign countries, not least of which was the United Kingdom, which in the same year ended its embargo, or very stricter embargo on trade with China that it had put in place during the Korean War. That very strict embargo by the end of the 1950s and into the 1960s was really only upheld by the United States. It was a Korean War era embargo that in 1957 the United Kingdom, Japan, and West Germany and others ended. And so as they were ending, and they very much the UK in particular led the way in ending that embargo. It was driven by a number of factors, not least of which is Hong Kong, but also the fact that the Canton Trade Fair was opening. So it was after the Canton Trade Fair had opened that the UK ended its embargo and sort of, in that process wanted to start trading with China too. So you see a slight edge or a slight effort to sort of increase foreign trade on the part of China, and it happens in the Canton Trade Fair. But of course, this is right at the moment when the Great Leap Forward comes into place, and when China's economy gets absolutely decimated, and its capacity to focus on foreign trade is profoundly limited. So it becomes in the late 1950s and 1960s a place mostly of, as you say at the time, to developing nations coming for sort of a form of sort of soft diplomacy, as a kind of sort of cultural sort of sense of connection, but it's also the key place. It's a sort of cultural diplomacy site, but it's also a key site of economics throughout the 1960s and very much continuing into the 1970s. So in the ways that perhaps today the Canton Trade Fair has a more sort of limited clientele or a limited niche in what it provides, in the 1960s and then particularly from the 1970s, it was the central way in which anyone at all wanted to trade with China had to start. So even if you would end up going to Beijing, or you'd end up going to Shanghai, or where usually it's Beijing or Shanghai in the 70s, you would have to start in Guangzhou. And that was really crucial, again, to sort of controlling the trade, but also as a sort of reflection of the ways that those institutions were operating in that time. So it's precisely because these foreign business people are all living together. You've got the West Germans and the French and the Brits and the Americans, all sort of working together. They form various kinds of communities. They play soccer together, football, I should say, and it is very much a sort of a cultural experience as well.
When the Americans were kind of shocked, right, when they first came and said, all these European and Asian competitors have been here for a long time, and we're kind of the new people here, and it's kind of
exactly.
And we have an audience question now, and this question asks only a detail, but you mentioned the original idea of 400 million potential Chinese consumers of U.S. products. Surely in the 1970s, this was quote unquote pie in the sky. What proportion of individual Chinese people were in a position to purchase imported American products at that time? Thanks for the talk. Very interesting and well presented, says the questioner.
Great. Thank you so much. That's a great question. And I should say that when I speak of 400 million customers, I mean it both specifically in terms of let's sell our goods to China, but also symbolically as an idea of what does trade mean? Does it mean exporting in general to China or importing from China? So at the time, the things that were being sold, or I suppose the Chinese customers, were large-scale manufacturing items, such as whole turnkey factories, right? So selling to China meant selling turnkey factories, or it meant selling airplanes, so Boeing airplanes, etc. So I use it in the book as both specific means of selling certain things, but also as a mindset that suggests that what matters the most is exporting to rather than importing from. And that shift in thinking about importing from China is something that was cultivated and pursued in this 1970s period, very deliberately so. So it's a great question. In terms of Chinese people and the specifics of your question, when were Chinese consumers in a position to be able to buy? I make a very brief mention of this in the conclusion of the book, in the sense that the capacity for Chinese consumers to buy the cheap goods that their own workers have made really only started to emerge from the late 1980s, 1990s at best, and that consumer market within China really explodes after the changes that I've been describing have already occurred. So after the sort of very changes in trade and manufacturing and finance underpinning it all had already very much internationalized. So it's a great question. Thank you.
And here's one more audience question, actually. And this question says, besides the low cost, what convinced U.S. businesses to outsource their production to China rather than elsewhere, and not elsewhere? So why pick China and not elsewhere, besides the cost issue, if anything?
They were picking elsewhere as well. So it wasn't that we're choosing China over other places. It's so JCPenney list, for example, as my example, listed China amongst others. So one of the key things, therefore, is it gets back to this question of China's taken our jobs, right? The Trump kind of language. These were changes happening structurally within US capitalism, of which Chinese pragmatists themselves wanted to encourage US business people to look to. And so you see, for example, and I trace this in the book, the ways that Chinese, particularly those at the Ministry of Foreign Trade, were selling China's workers. So in advertisements, for example, they were not just showing the goods you could buy from China, so the goods you could import as an American importer from China, but also selling the worker behind the good itself. So the advertisements that the Ministry of Foreign Trade and elsewhere were producing in China were selling the sort of superiority of the Chinese worker, the sort of attention to detail, etc. These sort of these stereotypes and myths of a sort of docile Chinese worker, seeped in racialized sort of historic meanings, were used as a sort of selling point of China itself. But where the sort of real concern therefore lay was in the very sort of scale of what China represented. It was such a large group of potential workers, such a big sort of space in which, if this were to take hold, as the labor movement in the United States was concerned about, it would exacerbate these larger dynamics happening elsewhere as well. That the very nature of China and the size of China meant that it operated distinctly in that way.
Great. We have yet another audience question, and another good one, which asks, at some point, could you comment on how this historical research could shed light upon the turning of political narrative, or I guess the shifting political narrative in the United States, I guess today, this sort of, how we get from constructive engagement to this kind of very competitive, almost China bashing kind of narrative, which has actually transcended party lines and all kinds of other previous divisions, right? So I guess what's the relationship between the historical research and commentary in the 1970s and what we're seeing really within the last 10 years or so in the US political space?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot. And I think one of the things about the 1970s era, perhaps similar to today, is that geopolitics was very much the defining factor in US-China relations. So US-China relations in the 1970s was very much determined by sort of can the United States and China work together to sort of a form of triangular diplomacy against the Soviet Union, and sort of work together towards a diplomatic normalization, so normalize after over 20 years of Cold War isolation. So the geopolitical questions, therefore, centered in particular on questions of Taiwan. So Taiwan was central to the question for the United States and China in the 70s about whether they can reach an agreement on normalization, because the implications of normalization meant the United States would need to change the nature of its political and military relationship with Taiwan, which in the 1970s remained intact. The United States throughout the 70s, as it had done for the 50s and 60s, recognized the Republic of China as China. And so the process, therefore, of the 70s was how do you maneuver around that and change that? And the outcome was this concept of strategic ambiguity, that the United States would recognize that both Taiwan and China felt that there was only one China, and that was a recognition that the United States would have. And that strategic ambiguity was what enabled the normalization of US-China relations to occur in the late 1970s. And that notion of strategic ambiguity, therefore, enabled geopolitics by the 1980s and 1990s and even into the 2000s. It enabled geopolitics to take a little more of a back step in terms of US-China relations, because after that sort of strategic ambiguity and the question of Taiwan remained ambiguous, unresolved but ambiguous, it was able to go on a back burner in terms of hierarchy of interest in US-China relations. And for sort of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the most important sort of dynamic, I think, in US-China relations was economics. And it was the sort of the real solidification of this process that I'm describing of the 70s. So my story is one of the quiet change that was going on beneath the surface of geopolitics that really continued right until the 2000s. So what we're seeing today, I think, is a shift then in that dynamic between these sort of structural considerations, whereby we have a very interdependent, or the United States and China have a very interdependent economic relationship, but the nature of geopolitics has changed such that it has now sort of framed the way that US-China relations operate. And I think that sort of turning point, if you ask the question, Ying, about sort of the turning point in political narratives, it's partly to do, I think, with specifically the election of Donald Trump. I do think that the extent to which Trump came into power does reveal the way that an individual can lead to quite significant and long-term change. So the Biden administration's agreeing with the idea of strategic competition, and Obama administration officials coming out and saying engagement failed and all the rest of it. That was very much triggered by Trump. And yet his concept of strategic competition, the shift that occurred under Trump, was beginning to emerge under the Bush Jr. administration as well. So it was under Bush, who before 9/11 in January and February of 2001 labeled China a strategic competitor. So you see in early 2001 this starting points of rethinking sort of what the geopolitical dynamic with China might be. It was the impact and in fact distraction, I think, of 9/11 and the war, the ongoing decades of war in Afghanistan and Iraq that sort of distracted US leaders from what had sort of initially been a China, sort of perhaps the start of a sort of a rethinking of China and geopolitical considerations there. So you do see threads that Trump certainly quite suddenly was able to sort of pull upon and then pull down very strictly.
What about that third leg of your tripod, though, of the cultural
culture?
I mean, that one to me is a little bit more ambiguous. I mean, I think the story that you told of the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, and then 2010s of the shifting priority of sort of politics versus economics, and the way that when one stabilizes, the other sort of becomes more important. but culture, you've sort of left out of that story, at least for now, in this brief answer to the question. How do you see that leg evolving through this?
So I see, for me, the way I understand culture is both something that operates within these two dynamics, so politics and economics, but also beyond. So the cultural shifts, for example, that I look at in the 1970s were essential to and enabled the larger political and economic shifts that occurred. So they were both assisting that process, but they were also distinct from it too. And what you had, for example, was in the 1960s, there was a cultural sympathy towards China amongst radicals and left-wing groups within the United States, that cultural idea of China became co-opted by the corporate world. It became co-opted by those wanting to put dollar signs right on the revolution. That the revolution. Like Veronica Yap, exactly like Veronica Yap, yeah. And I think this it speaks to the real cynicism of this era. And there are scholars who've been looking at this more broadly when looking at the hippie movement and all the rest of it. The co-optation of cool, and all the rest of it. The ways that these cultural changes can get co-opted into and therefore assist different kinds of aims, political or economic. But I think your question also, this idea of what role might culture play in sort of mitigating against some of the worst elements of heightened either economic dynamics or heightened geopolitical tensions. I think there's a really significant space for cultural ties and communications and networks and all the rest of it in sort of creating alternative spheres and creating alternative modes of communication and of thinking about cross-cultural and cross-nation contacts that can soften the worst of the hawkishness of geopolitics or the worst of the sort of corporatization of economics. And so there is also, I think, a real potentiality there in pulling the others, the other two legs of that tripod, in a less binary fashion or a less hawkish fashion, which certainly at the moment we're in a sort of hawkish world when it comes to US-China relations.
Yeah, and I wondered to the extent cultural connections depend also on kind of physical connections, in that with COVID and lockdown and the severing of most direct links for people to spend time in the other country between the US and China, and indeed between most countries and China, that haven't really been restored. Was that going to get in the way of sort of restoring this cultural side of the relationship? Even just last week, I think Antony Blinken was in Beijing a week or maybe 2 weeks ago and said, it's a shame that there are only a few hundred US students still studying in China when there used to be tens of thousands. And so I guess a part of my thinking still wonders, will we ever see a restoration of that cultural relationship or cultural ties that maybe were very important, particularly perhaps in the 80s and 90s, and really building up that economic relationship? Do you think that perhaps politics is still getting in the way of that in a sense?
I think politics is always going to get in the way of these things, right? In different ways. But we've seen it before, right? Throughout the 1950s and 60s, cultural ties, scientific ties, all forms of ties were cut. These were a Korean War hangover that remained in place for 20 years. And so, in fact, in the 1970s period itself, it's precisely this moment that cultural ties are rebuilt after such a long period of political decision to cut them off. But even then, even in the 1950s and 60s, you do have small pockets of communication and of cultural richness and of connections. And there have been some brilliant scholars sort of looking at the ways in which individuals were able to navigate these spaces. It was particularly enabled if you were, China would enable it if you were of a particular political persuasion, right? So if you were leftist and if you were radical, that would be very much encouraged. You see a lot of sort of Black Americans and leaders of the civil rights movement, going to China with, on a red carpet trip. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the most important thinkers of Black thought. And of the 20th century and 21st century for that matter, he was given red carpet treatment in China in the 1950s. So you do, I suppose, we've seen before some of the most extreme dynamics in which policies and politics have sought to sort of curtail cultural ties. We're not there yet, right? We are not living in that kind of dynamic. I hope that we don't get to that point. But I suppose there is very much a rich history of people working from the margins and within and beyond the sort of legislative boundaries that get imposed from above.
That's true. So I think we have time for maybe one more audience question at least, and there is indeed one more, which says, will newly realized prosperity, if constrained by preference of control over commerce or for control over commerce, result in domestic contention? Would such over time improve Hong Kong and market regulation? I guess I'm a little confused by the question. The best way I can interpret this would be to say, would we see an increase in sort of domestic political contestation or conflict with rising economic fortunes? And might we then see a sort of renewed focus on using Hong Kong or market regulations as a way to ensure prosperity and restrict that domestic politics contestation inside China? If, for example, Chinese labor actors are not so happy with market rules and increased prosperity for the country, they could be silenced perhaps with this kind of regulation. I think maybe is what the question is getting at. But feel free to take that interpretation or whatever interpretation you think is better of the question in your response.
Yeah, it's an I read this as an interesting sort of reflection on this really big, I think, fundamental question that development scholars and people thinking about development policies grapple with, which is in some ways, how do you build a good society? How do you build a society in which the people within it can lead like good lives? And to what extent does controlling commerce? So if I'm just reading through this question here, to what extent do sort of government imposed or top down imposed controls sort of result in sort of domestic unease or unrest? And I think the answer there has less to do with the presence of regulation or less to do with, it's not the nature of regulation itself that leads to unrest, but of course the very sort of nature of what those regulations might be, or what is being done, and the extent to which they are successfully leading to good, meaningful lives for individuals. And I think that that's something that happens not just in material outcomes are central to that question. So people's capacity to eat, to clothe themselves, to house themselves, it will determine their sense of sort of contentment or not. But that's sort of a baseline level of contentment. And then above that, of course, are a whole range of other kinds of freedoms and senses of being able to lead a life that is your own. So I think that question has, in my view, not been answered well in any country in the world. I look at the United States today, and I look at my colleagues on campuses in the United States, and I am appalled at the ways in which they are facing extraordinary violence and disproportionate violence. I think this is a question that is fundamentally at the heart of all societies and all politics, and I wish we could get to a point where there isn't domestic discontent, but I don't think any human society has gotten there.
Wow. On that note, on that very uplifting and optimistic note, I think we're probably ready to draw to a close. So was there anything else you wanted to close with?
I just wanted to say thank you, William. It's been such a pleasure, and I really appreciate how closely and thoughtfully you've read the book. It was a real labor of love, so it's really, I appreciate a lot your questions and your engagement. It's been wonderful to hear, at least to read the questions from the audience. It's always strange when you're doing these things via Zoom, but it's been a real pleasure to share my ideas with everyone, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone in the audience. Thank you, Elizabeth Ingleson, for a fabulous talk on a really interesting book. And for everyone in the audience, please do look for the recording online of this, which will come out soon, and also subscribe for that, and look for more events like this from the Center for Geopolitics. So thank you, everyone, and good evening.
Great. Thanks, Will.